Morning, everybody. And Ned, thank you very much for having me. And more important, thank you for the work of the center. And I think the topic chosen for today is very spot on for the times in which we live, that there's a concern among us as economists, for those of you in the room who are economists, about sources of dynamism, as to use Ned's term, or Deirdre McCloskey's term, innovism. But there is also a concern in the present time, and that's the one I want to speak about this morning, another political economy matter about what it takes to keep that. And let me start with a story. When I stepped down as dean of the business school, I moved my teaching from a finance course to be part of the bread and butter of the institution to political economy. And I had a group of students who were skeptical of capitalism. Now, these are not political science majors at 1 o'clock in the morning. These are Columbia Business School students. And to speak to them in a way that I knew they would read, I put a piece in the Atlantic around Christmas, figuring that my usual haunts in the Wall Street Journal or places like that are not where they would turn. But I put it in the Atlantic, and I reminded them in class of the Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian, where the protagonists are saying, "What did the Romans ever do for us?" And then they list all the many things the Romans ever did for them, and said, hey, you know, maybe it's not so bad. And so I said, that's capitalism. Of course, the problem for me was only half of the students in the room had ever even heard of Monty Python. There was a generational moment at that time. But I raised this story with you because my student skepticism is not what the media thinks, nor is it what politicians think. This is not a serious debate about capitalism versus socialism, which is what you commonly hear about, but rather, to the point of Ned's conference today, things that capitalism isn't doing to bring everyone along for the ride. I was so taken by this conversation with the students, I wrote a book that came out earlier this year from Yale Press called The Wall and the Bridge. And for those of you who are looking for Christmas presents, I highly recommend it. Thousands of copies are available for you. The Wall and the Bridge is a love letter, a paean to Adam Smith, in a way I'll make clear the idea that economists really do know what to do here if we move beyond our neoliberal fashioning that we often take on with students. Now, to begin, here's the challenge. The whole dynamism agenda of Ned and this center, in fact, relates to growth, as Ned said in his opening remarks. And it's not a surprise that many economists, including me and some of my work, have focused a lot on growth. You know, Bob Lucas, like Ned, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, once famously said that, you know, even small changes in growth matter the world. It's why economists spend the time there. The stakes are even larger. One of my teachers, Ben Friedman, made the point in a book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth that growing societies aren't just more prosperous. They are more moral, they are more stable, they are less racist, they are less anti-Semitic. We all have a dog in this fight. Here's the problem. It's not just my student skepticism for capitalism. Even on voices that would call themselves the contemporary right, I take, for example, recent work by Oren Cass, have said that the way to get back to economic normalcy is to repudiate Adam Smith and I guess every economist's sense, with the idea toward taking consumption out of the center of the story and saying we should be protecting certain jobs and certain industries. Now, the way in which I think economists must re-enter this debate is to remind the general public what we know, which is think about a coin. Coins have two sides. And so when we talk about growth, that's a great thing. It's the heads of a coin. But no serious theory of economic growth is linear and incremental. It's very disruptive. The tails side of the coin is always disruption and change, and that's where the politics starts. For many Americans, for many people in industrial economies around the world, they have been experiencing the changes in recent decades from two tectonic shifts that we as economists celebrate. The most important, although not always the most covered in the media, is technological advance, and the second is globalization. The challenge for elites, I would put everyone in this room in that category, business people, politicians, is noticing. Remember the Queen of England, the late Queen of England, I should say, I asked the following question in the financial crisis of economists at the London School of Economics: why did nobody see it coming? And I think what the Queen meant was, how can there be very important low-frequency changes that you all who are experts simply miss? The current wave of populism is just that. My concern as an economist isn't over science or economics. You know, when economists talk about growth, in the contemporary world, we talk about what it takes to develop general purpose technologies. Think about, over time, things from the internal combustion engine to electrification, mainframe computing, internet today, robotics, artificial intelligence. Those are the kinds of industries that generate growth not only in and of themselves, but bring everything along with them. I'm not terribly worried, although some economists are, that we're going to see a lack of progress there. Nor am I terribly worried that we don't know what to do in terms of public policies to sustain growth. We talk about this in Q&A if you like, but John Taylor and I have had some work over time, another economist at Stanford, on policies for long-term growth. My concern is the political process. And here I'll tell the second of the two stories I wanted to tell you this morning. When I was George Bush's economic advisor in the White House, I was the only person in a room that lobbied against steel tariffs. And I did so because I look like an economist from central casting, and I am. And I was sure bad. In the morning of the meeting where I was granted one-on-one time with him before we had our general meeting, my wife reminded me that the world is divided in only two groups of people: economists and real people. And she said, "You are an economist. He is for sure a real person. Be careful." So I didn't go in with Econ 101. I can tell from all of you that Econ 101 was your favorite class. I didn't go in with the standard Econ 101 stuff. I went in with two charts. One chart was a declining share of labor over time. And he said, yes, I'm trying to stop the decline in manufacturing jobs. I said, I didn't label the axis, sir. That was actually agriculture, 1900 to 1940. Would it have been your aspiration to put them back on the farm? No, I could see by the look on his face, score 1 for econ. Then I showed him a second chart. It was a national map at the county level of projected job losses. And he said, but I don't understand. I'm doing this to protect jobs. I said, but wait a minute, steel is an input. And so think about everything that's downstream from steel. What are the job losses you're going to cause? I've asked the team to put them together, and there it is. And I could tell by the look I'd scored another point. Then he decided exactly the opposite. And so I went to see him, figuring, you know, that's the life of being an economist. I went back to see him, and he said, you know, I agree with everything you said. I said, well, why didn't I make the sale? And he said, because you didn't tell me how I could help anyone left behind. He said, you don't understand, Hubbard, that I went to Wheeling, West Virginia in the campaign. And I told a lot of people left behind that I was going to change their life. You came in telling me why steel tariffs were bad. You didn't have an alternative. Now, the actual political system is struggling with this today. Not, again, in this capitalism versus socialism way of putting it, but with what I like to call in my book, walls and bridges. So walls are obvious. They are promises by politicians to protect an economy, a community, a firm, a way of life, a set of individuals from change. It can be everything from, if you don't like global steel competition, I'll make it 1955 again. If you don't like technologies because they make your job redundant, we'll tax them. Walls can be physical on a border. They can be metaphorical against immigration, against ideas, against change in general. The power they have is their simplicity. It is very easy for a politician to say, I'll make it right again. Indeed, for years I've taken students to Youngstown, Ohio, right in the center of this country, which has been a place hit hard by change. And if you talk to local people, they remind you that every 4 years, both Democrat and Republican politicians, it's bipartisan, come in with essentially the same promise, a promise never kept. Now, economists aren't surprised that walls don't work. In fact, I mentioned Smith before. The Burr and Smith side, if you will, that got him to write The Wealth of Nations was his concern with mercantilism, which was the philosophy of the day of building trade surpluses, of protection, and putting the sovereign at the center of the story. The purpose of these surpluses was to fund military adventures and luxury for the sovereign. Smith said, nope, you can turn it on its head. Average people are the center. It's consumption. It's the economy's ability to fund that that matters. Mercantilism is wrong. Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, went on to establish what some people today would call laissez-faire. I think quite opposite. That Smith had ways in which the government, in ordering the rules of the game, could definitely influence outcomes. In fact, closer to the work that Ned has taught us over many years, 17 years before Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith picks up on a phrase in his words of mutual sympathy, what I think today we might call empathy, that is very close to what Ned has talked about for many years of mass flourishing. That the goal of an economy is not simply an average statistic, which might be dominated by one part of the income distribution or another, but mass flourishing. Smith's ideas, I think, are very important, despite the fact that he did not have a theory of economic growth. Smith's ideas in The Wealth of Nations are about maximizing the size of the pie, we might call GDP today. He wrote, in fact, The Wealth of Nations before the post-1800 roughly 30-fold increases in living standards. But nonetheless, Smith was right in the sense that openness to change, to ideas, to production processes, to markets, to the movement of goods and capital and labor is important in contemporary models of economic growth and of dynamism. But there, of course, is where political economy rears its head. And one guy's corporatism, the fascist agenda to which Ned referred, where companies would try to use the state for protection, but another is political invitations to individuals, to communities left behind to join. In fact, as Raghuраjan and Luigi Zingales have reminded us, the coalition of firms left behind and people and communities left behind can be quite powerful and quite toxic in politics. Now, here's the rub. It's not surprising with all of that walls are on offer. Your Econ 101 professor probably told you that too. An essence of Smith's argument was really, in my words, not his, preparation for participation in the economy. Smith, of course, centered the fine Swiss watch machine of The Wealth of Nations as competition, or the invisible hand. The Smith of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and I would argue if Smith were speaking to us today in his language with today's world, would be about the ability to compete. He would say that to voices on the right who are against trade and immigration, and voices on the left who would use the corporation sometimes for other purposes. I think it's clear that we need to address more than laissez-faire if we want to focus on an ability to compete. And the problem with the tectonic changes I mentioned of technological advance and globalization is that three things are politically salient about them and why this is a political economy discussion and not just an economics discussion. One is that the changes are long-lasting. This is not a simple one-and-done disruption. It will be long-term changes in livelihoods, in communities, in industrial structure. The second is speed. This has all happened much, much faster than people had imagined. Being part of the debates in late 90s, early 2000s about China's accession to the WTO, I think it's fair to say that many economists, myself included, were somewhat glib in talking to policymakers about the consequences of the speed of China's integration into the world. And the third is geographical concentration of effects. If you look at a map of the United States, just like I looked at job losses for Bush 20 years ago, if you looked at job losses from what we're going through now, they too are geographically concentrated. That matters especially in an economy like the United States, where our political system is very tied to geography. And so geographical concentration matters. The key here from an economic perspective is to change the channel from walls to something else. Now, the something else can't be what economists typically do, which is to revert to neoliberalism. How many times have we heard a center-right or center-left economist come up and say, well, the solution would be to reform the tax code, or to change regulation, or maybe change the way the federal budget works in a particular way. As wonderful as some of those ideas might be, they are not the answer to the problem. Rather, the answer to a wall must be a bridge. Now, a bridge is by definition something that takes you to something or takes you back. And it's a problem when they're not there. Look at the pictures this morning from Sanibel Island in Florida. It matters. A bridge that takes you to something in Smithian terms would be preparation, the ability to compete. A bridge that takes you back would be reconnection. In modern econ language, something like social insurance. Now, how not to do this and why we've failed. There's a program little known beyond Washington called Trade Adjustment Assistance. Trade Adjustment Assistance was an idea President Kennedy had in opening up the economy, that we would help people left behind by trade. Now, quick sidebar, shouldn't matter to you whether your job loss is caused by a domestic competitor, a foreign competitor, from technology, which was the far bigger factor. But be that as it may, the real issue was that trade adjustment assistance was only brought up by politicians when they wanted to get more trade agreements, and maybe 4 people in a chicken over time were helped by it. It's simply not very useful. But we did once know how to do this. I'll give you 2 examples. One is an old one. In the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, in addition to prosecuting an existential campaign for the nation, introduced a series of radical bridge policies. Emancipation is probably the most familiar, but for what I wanted to speak about this morning, I think of others. I think of land-grant colleges. I think of the Homestead Act. I think of the Transcontinental Railroad. Go back and read the recent book called Ways and Means about Lincoln's finance ideas in his cabinet, and it's quite clear that Lincoln believed the purpose of the state was really, in addition to defense and pure public goods, to generate opportunity. So we do know how to do this. The land-grant colleges, which are a metaphor in my book, are truly a lasting innovation. A second example I would just mention is Franklin Roosevelt's GI Bill, which took as a goal reconnection. Millions of service people were returning to an economy that had changed a lot. And since they left, how do you cope with change? Connection, preparation, and reconnection. How do you do this today? In today's world, the foot soldiers to protect capitalism as a bridge are less the land-grant colleges, although they remain important, but today's community colleges. The 2-year institutions all over the country that both prepare many men and women for entry into work and are the places where skills can be retaught for people left behind. A problem is how woefully underfunded community colleges are, not only absolutely, but relative to their 4-year peers in states. Austin Goolsbee, a fellow economist, and I put out a proposal some years ago for a federal block grant for community colleges built on the Morrill Act, the land-grant college movement. We were told at the time that its 10-year budget cost of $300 billion was too much money for the nation. Of course, President Biden just spent $400 billion at a stroke of a pen for giving some student loans. So maybe we should come back to that conversation. But community colleges are important. The second is to reform what's in this country is a subsidy for labor called the Earned Income Tax Credit that started life as a work support program, but to be brief, is principally a family support program at the moment. We need much larger supports for work. Much of skill acquisition over one's lifetime is on the job, not from a book. For reconnection, I think 2 things that we could do in the modern world. One would be to reconnect long-term unemployed people with the job market. The book I talk about a proposal for so-called personal reemployment accounts, devolving the money we spend on training and reskilling more to an individual level. The second is more controversial among economists at least, which is place-based aid. Like many economists, I used to be very skeptical of place-based aid. Why not move people to opportunities? Isn't that the right answer? In fact, mobility, geographical mobility, has declined a lot in the country. It has always been less of an issue in Europe as well than it is in the United States. We need to think about smart place-based aid, and there are a number of economists who have ideas there. I would also mention that business has a role to play here. When I speak to business people, business leaders about problems like this, their idea is, if government is dysfunctional, why are you talking to me? I can only get in trouble by weighing in on this debate. I disagree. The reason I disagree is I think many business people take support for the system as given. Go back to where I started with my MBA students. They take it as a bedrock that people support the market capitalist system. We're just disagreeing around the edges about the marginal tax rate. I think we're in a debate much more fundamental, and business people have a dog in this fight. And the second is the government itself has to get serious about this. While we do have agencies in the government that coordinate on national security and on defense, we don't have that coordination really for problems like this in the domestic economy. And I think it is important to do so. To go back to where I began, I think that the people like my MBA students who doubt the benefits of capitalism actually do in many ways see that government policy has helped the system's survival. Limits on monopoly power have preserved competition. Government spending during crisis has forestalled greater catastrophe. We've seen that in recent years. But what they see missing, because likely it is missing, is evidence that the system can generate Ned's mass flourishing. I think they're looking for, and we should be looking for, proof that it can work without leaving people and communities to their neoliberal fate. Businesses, I hope, keep pushing for the positive forces for change. Without that, go back to my coin, without that, growth won't happen. Business definitely has to support technological advance and globalization. But if business people, and even center-right politicians who may go along with them, want even my MBA students to go along with them, they'll need to embrace a much bolder agenda. So political implications, I think what's facing us isn't a science or an economics problem. On the one hand, that makes it sound easy. We don't have to invent a new general purpose technology. We'll wait for one. But on the other hand, it's hard. Political economy problems, culture problems are hard at their core relative to science and relative to economics. What we mustn't do is abandon pro-growth policy, because if we throw away the disruption, we'll throw away growth. Nor should we focus only on limited government neoliberal answers. What we should do is think hard about preparation for and reconnection to work, a theme that the center, and Ned in particular, has stressed for many years. We need to think hard about places that are left behind by disruption, returning to my point about geographic concentration, and we need to think hard about mass flourishing. If we don't do this, what follows is either an agenda from the left we may not like, or a corporatist agenda from the right we may not like. So I would leave you with this: MAGA with an asterisk. A asterisk, G-A, and the asterisk is Adam Smith. Make Adam Smith great again. So thank you. I think we have time for questions, or?
I guess we should go by the timer.
Okay, it's a little over 5 minutes, so yeah. Ned has granted me 5:50.
Take 3 or 4 minutes.
Questions?
You folks haven't had enough coffee. Yes, sir. Over there.
So I really like that, particularly because I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. And you endorsed a number of things of Ned's that I also endorse, and his good friend who brought me to Ned, John Rawls, the philosopher, endorsed. And one thing that Rawls particularly endorsed only at the end of his life was the idea of government being the employer of last resort. And I think the public sector has to focus from that perspective, and I'm guessing you might agree, not just on the public good side, the consumption side of we need these public goods, it's good to invest in parks and infrastructure and so on, but also on the employment side of and seeing that people have jobs, and if the market isn't providing jobs, a private job market, then there's need for support for that. And so to take it back to that, I'm sorry I'm taking so long to ask this, but you didn't say specifically Ned's proposal of wage subsidies as a solution to this, and I wonder what you think about that idea.
To the great set of questions, to the first part, I may disappoint, but I don't think the government should be the employer of last resort. Going back to the Lincoln example, the role of government is to both prepare people and reconnect people to the economy that is. To wage subsidies are two ways from an economic perspective you can approach them. You could subsidize labor demand, which Ned has talked about mainly in the European context. In the US, we have a support where we're topping off incomes of individuals. I think we need to work harder at both of those and think about what makes sense, but we should be willing to spend what it takes as a society to keep people attached to meaningful work. As Ned has reminded us, I believe even in his Nobel lecture, satisfaction and a feeling of flourishing in society is tied toward participation, and which is why, like many economists, I'm skeptical of ideas that would pension people off outside of participation in the meaningful economy that is.
Thank you. In your talk, you mentioned Adam Smith and the wealth. As far as I understood, you didn't mention the book.
It might be good to give your names before speaking.
Okay, I'm Peter Jungen. I'm from Germany. In your talk, you mentioned Adam Smith, the wealth. As far as I understood, you didn't mention a book which Adam Smith thought is his most important book on sentiment, on moral sentiment.
Oh, I not only mentioned it, I highlighted it. I do think it's the more important book. It's the theme of my book.
Yeah, exactly. But I didn't understand whether or not you mentioned it. And in his book, he particularly a phrase you used is they concentrate on empathy. Would this not be a way to explain that Adam Smith is bringing the best arguments sort of for capitalism, and we don't need any other ideas on that because it's in the fundamental ideas of Smith included?
Well, you had me up to the very last part. I don't think of Smith's two books as the Bible or the Ten Commandments or something like that, but I do think that the theory of moral sentiments, with its emphasis on what we today would call empathy, what Smith called mutual sympathy, is incredibly important and is the true Smith. And that's why I say if he were here, I don't think he would just use the word competition. He would think it hollow to say competition if not everybody was able to compete. In some sense, the self-taught Lincoln, who I don't know if he'd ever read the theory of moral sentiments or not, got that idea about opportunity. And that's what's missing in a lot of our political debate today, and why I worry if we, as economists, default into talking about capitalism versus socialism, we're missing the real debate, which is about bridges. Yeah.
Christine Helmer, Humanities Professor at Northwestern University. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role of social media and the news in shaping bridges and walls, because I think your model is going to be complicated by the sort of algorithms that are being produced in order to divide the country.
It's an incredibly good question. Every politician that I talk to about these ideas starts there and says, I really like it, but you don't have a bumper sticker. You don't have a soundbite. When Donald Trump, who I guess isn't a friend of Ned's, I gather from the opening remarks, when Donald Trump says build the wall, we kind of know what that means, right? It's not just an expression of three words. It is a view, a way of thinking. bridges have to be explained. So I think that's where the rubber will meet the road. Now, the good news is there are places in the country that have gotten this right. So in the book, I talk about a series of case studies. Youngstown, sadly, isn't one of the places that's gotten it right, but Pittsburgh has. Much of the state of Massachusetts has. And we can learn from how those leaders and business people are communicating, what channels they're using to get at this. So I agree, it's a huge question. Part of what has whipped up our current frenzy in politics is the ability of social media to allow people to exist in very small groups, unlike the world in which I grew up, where there were a handful of television stations, handful of major newspapers, and people were closer together.
Thank you very much.
Okay, looks like I'm being given, at least numerically, the boot, so I'll take that from Ned. Thank you for having me.